Home from work one day,
I didn't feel like cooking anything.
I took the phone to say,
I'll have a pizza with lots of everything.
the man arrived with tears in his eyes and said, look what you've got. As I raised the lid, he said, it's a miracle from God. It was the face of the Virgin Mary right there in my pizza box. The mozzarella looked really scary in the shape of her golden locks. Her almond eyes were the pepperoni, the tomato sauce had that glow. A gift from God were the anchovies, and the mushroom formed her upturned nose. I stood there aghast. The pizza man had fainted on the floor. Now I had to think fast. Call the papers and the news on Channel 4. I had heard of this kind of thing. I read it in the grocery line. My prayers have been answered all for $12.99. It was the face of the Blessed Mother. The upstairs neighbors ran to see. They said it's true, it could be no other, in the halo crust with sesame. Police arrived to control the crowd, and to see it was no lie.
And then a man yelled really loud,
by God, another cheesy shrine. It was a scene. All those people crowded in my house. No one could foresee the disaster that was to come about. Standing near the pizza box was this little kid. No one noticed and no one saw, and this is what he did. He ate the face of the Virgin Mary. The garlic rolled down past his gums. Some people screamed and some were very frightened of what was to come. I grabbed the box, saving some, and said as I recall, there is a little for everyone, and remember God is in us all.
You outdid me.
Okay, Woody Allen once said, I took a test in existentialism. I left all the answers blank and got 100%. If that is existentialism in a nutshell, Kelly McBride may fill us in on some of the meat in that nutshell. An Oregon native, Kelly received her undergraduate degree from the University of Oregon and her master's from studying at two universities who have a joint program, Kingston University in London and the Université Paris 8, both of those degrees in philosophy. She currently has her own business as a copywriter and editor with a background in scholarly publishing. She also writes for various publications online and in print, including the film blog Sublime Horror. She spoke to our group in November on early horror films and people of color. Two of her nonfiction pieces are currently nominated for Bram Stoker Awards. Yeah. Ms. McBride says her interest in existentialism came from reading Albert Camus, but I wonder if she has always felt that her personal subjective reality was the only true reality, as existentialists often espouse. She told me that when she was 5, she got upset at the aquarium and resolved to write a sternly worded letter to the management because she did not see one single mermaid. Be that as it may, I am intrigued by her take on existentialism as humanism. So I give you Kelly McBride.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back here at Humanists of Greater Portland. I really enjoyed the last time I was here giving a talk about early horror films and stereotyping people of color. And today we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about something a little bit different, but maybe a little bit closer to the subject that we all kind of came here together for, being humanism. So this presentation title is maybe a slight misnomer because I'm going to be mostly talking about one essay in particular by the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called Existentialism is a Humanism. And where it was a really famous essay kind of devoted to saving existentialism from the eyes of his critics and maybe justify it a little bit in terms of the historical context that was going on at the time. So I will dive right into it. I think it might be prudent to sort of define what existentialism is at the outset, just so that we're all clear. It has to come from the existentialism region of France, otherwise it's just sparkling anxiety. I found that on the internet the other day, and I'm like, yep, that's going in the slides. So contrary to other philosophies of the 19th and 20th centuries, existentialism almost constituted a return to ancient Greek principles that philosophy was a way of life, it was a means to be lived, versus something to be just studied in isolation or within the confines of the academy. Existentialism is loosely made up of a wide variety of philosophers, theorists, and novelists who wrote things about freedom, authenticity, and especially the primacy of the individual as opposed to a collective good. And the idea of individualism here, too, is going to be really, really important as far as kind of unifying the various existentialist philosophers, because otherwise it kind of starts to seem like a random group of people sort of talking about a similar thing, but no one quite knows what it is. A little bit confusing, but I'll get to that in a minute. So maybe a good way of positing this would be questions like, why am I here versus why are we here? In particular, I'm going to be talking about the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. So he's probably the most well-known of the existentialist philosophers, having attained great fame because of his writings, his lifestyle, and his political activism. Sartre was a prolific writer whose writings spanned a wide range of genres. His philosophical works include two major treatises, being Nothingness, which was published in 1943, and Critique of Dialectical Reason, which was published in 1960. And it's also kind of important to make a distinction between the writings of the early Sartre versus the later Sartre, because Sartre later in his career almost did a complete 180 as to his previous ideas, and then he was like, no, I don't believe that anymore, and then kind of went in a different direction, got a lot more political kind of towards the end of his life, so that's why Sartre scholars often make that distinction, early Sartre versus later Sartre. Today we're going to be talking about early Sartre. It's also worth mentioning Sartre was more famous for his plays and his novels, so The Flies, No Exit. Are you all familiar with the phrase, hell is other people? So that came from his play No Exit from 1944, kind of talking along similar lines of themes of absurdity and isolation and abandonment, which we're going to be discussing more in detail later. And his novel Nausea, which was published in 1938, probably the greatest philosophical novel ever written. I would dispute that, but generally it's kind of thought of as one of the greatest existentialist novels. And it won a Nobel Prize, which Sartre vehemently rejected, which is another story because he was not very keen on the Nobel Prize community, so he was actually the first one probably to ever refuse it. And like many other existentialists at that time, Sartre believed that literature and the theater were areas for rich philosophical expression and engagement. It's also really important that we get a clear understanding of what Sartre's definition of humanism was versus humanism as kind of a larger philosophical and rhetorical umbrella. So humanism is a very general term usually used to refer to any theory which puts human beings at the center of things, so kind of bumping up against the existentialist idea of freedom and the individual will. So for instance, the humanism of the Renaissance was characterized by a movement away from the metaphysical speculation about the nature of God to a concern with the works of humanity, particularly in art and literature. And interestingly, too, Sartre is going to deviate from more metaphysical speculation and kind of put the human being at the center of philosophical discourse and investigation. So even if he may might not define himself as a humanist, he definitely has a lot of things in common with humanism. So humanism has the positive connotation of being humane. It is generally associated with an optimistic outlook. One version of humanism that Sartre rejects as absurd is the self-congratulatory reveling in the achievements of the human race. And this is Sartre being a little bit critical and negative here. You might argue that Sartre actually does, in kind of a backwards way, sort of affirm this as well. He's just not going to outwardly state, you know, like, humanism is a good thing, even if he might indirectly kind of conclude that way. So the humanism that he endorses emphasizes the dignity of human beings. It also stresses the centrality of human choice to the creation of all values. And this is going to be really, really important when we kind of dive into the essay a little bit, because his ethical stance is primarily concerned with, you know, you make a choice, it affects everybody around you. So Sartre's existentialism also captures the optimism usually associated with humanism, ironically enough. Despite the absence of a pre-established objective values, we are entirely responsible for what we become, and this is the future of humanity in our own hands. Sartre quotes Francis Ponge approvingly, "Man is the future of man." Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Sartre's influences and kind of a way of situating existentialism within the current philosophical trajectory in the canon. So one of his major influences was this sub-philosophy called phenomenology, which was started by this German Jewish philosopher named Edmund Husserl. He sought to establish a systemic foundational science for the experience of consciousness through what he called the phenomenological reduction. So the phenomenological reduction, or what he also simultaneously refers to as bracketing, which is the act of suspending judgment of the natural world to focus on the analysis of experience, specifically how that experience is lived in the natural world. So contrary to some philosophies which try to abstract the experience of human consciousness, Husserl really believed that, you know, these one-to-one interactions of, you know, what is the other consciousness thinking, how might my consciousness be in contrast with that consciousness. He really wanted to bring those types of questions to the forefront. This was also around the time when psychology was getting really established, so there's been a lot of comparisons with phenomenology and kind of proto-psychology at the time. And something really important for the discipline of phenomenology, but also later existentialism, was called the problem of intentionality. And intentionality does not mean, you know, like something has an intention. So intentionality is sort of talking about the experience of consciousness. So my consciousness will always be a consciousness of something. It's not just the faculty of consciousness sort of waywardly, you know, being out there in the world. Intentionality attributes there's a formal object to consciousness. And this sounds kind of weird, but it's actually really, really important, because it's going to sort of set up the foundations for how existentialism and phenomenology is going to be articulated later in the 20th century. Also worth noting, some of Husserl's students included notable philosophers, including Martin Heidegger, up here on the right, and Emmanuel Levinas on the bottom here. Two philosophers with kind of who had very similar philosophies but kind of drew different conclusions. We're going to talk about Heidegger too a little bit in terms of when we get to Sartre's metaphysics, because metaphysics is going to have an interesting turn sort of in the early 20th century. All right, so I'm going to talk about intentionality a little bit more. So intentionality is a philosophical concept defined as the power of minds to be about, to represent, or to stand for things, properties, and states of affairs. So the earliest theory of intentionality is associated with St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. So I know we're talking about humanism, and we're kind of disavowing the supernatural a little bit, but we need to kind of talk about God in order to talk about how God becomes less important in the 20th century, particularly in humanism. And so with Anselm's tenets distinguishing between objects that exist in the understanding, so purely conceptual objects and objects that exist within reality or the natural world. So this was kind of starting to be articulated a little bit. So something in like the philosophy of Descartes, you have the cogito, where, I think, therefore I am. Things in the mind exist just as much as things in our understanding of the world. They were trying to hash this out in the early modern period, but it didn't really get taken up as a real serious problem until we have Franz Bertano and Edmund Husserl in the 19th century. Bertano being Edmund Husserl's kind of teacher and mentor. So the problem of consciousness all of a sudden comes back in a very real, kind of heavy sort of way. And the thing about intentionality is the problem requires a formal object. So and then it kind of begs the question, how can dreams, fantasies, or hallucinations be a part of conscious experience if they are not experienced directly? And this is a real big problem for Sartre, but Sartre actually has an answer to this problem. So his response to intentionality is that everything is contingent and could have happened a different way. So, we might not have a verified understanding of the formal object, but we have contingency, and we can kind of work with contingency. And even if we're not 100% sure whether what we're experiencing is dreams or reality, we can kind of rely upon contingency to sort of have a working definition of these concepts. So this contingency, understandably, makes Sartre nauseous, and would later be the foundation for his novel Nausea, which would grant him a Nobel Prize. So, I kind of wish, I got a Nobel Prize every time I got sick thinking about something, but whatever. And so this is the part of the foundations of Sartre's philosophical commitments. So the random, seemingly arbitrary thingness of things, which we kind of attribute to existentialism, is kind of founded in this contingency, which is a response to the problem of intentionality. Kind of convoluted, but just stick with me, because I'm just trying to take you through all of the various trains of thought that are leading up to these particular conclusions. So in contrast to philosophers and theologians who argue there is an essential meaning of life, existence for Sartre is itself devoid of any inherent meaning. So when he says existence precedes essence, this is what he's talking about. So this contingency also kind of hollows out the underlying meaning to experience, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So if you're kind of fuzzy on this right now, just hang in there. Okay, also it's worth mentioning that existentialism did not begin with Jean-Paul Sartre. It was sort of already starting to form a little bit in the 19th century. So existentialists oftentimes were influenced by other existentialists. So, and I didn't label these. So this is Fyodor Dostoevsky, this is Soren Kierkegaard, and this is Friedrich Nietzsche, of course. And they all were kind of considered to be 19th century proto-existentialists. So again, as I've said before, contrary to popular belief, existentialist philosophers like Sartre, along with Camus and Merleau-Ponty, did not invent existentialism. In fact, they were already influenced by other existentialist philosophers. And not all existentialists agreed with each other, which is really important. So Kierkegaard over here on the far right was a devout Christian who believed that existentialism was predicated on faith, particularly Christian faith. Whereas kind of in the opposite, but almost a similar vein, Nietzsche was a staunch atheist who thought the absence of Christian morality freed humanity to pursue existentialist projects. And I'll talk a little bit more about what an existentialist project means a bit later. But again, the unifying belief between this loose category was that all of them believe that the origin of philosophical thinking begins with the human subject. So specifically the individual subject. All right, and now we're going to finally get to the essay, Existentialism is a Humanism. So this essay was by Sartre, published in 1946, based on a lecture given by the same name from the previous year, in which he sort of went about in front of a forum and tried to defend existentialism from various critics that it drew along the way. and so this essay contains two primary ideas, and these ideas, are important because they sort of set up some of the things that Sartre talks about in Being and Nothingness and some of his other literary and philosophical works from the time. So it's a really good essay, and one that a lot of intro to existentialism courses in universities and colleges like to use, just because it's very succinct and you're only given kind of two main ideas, but these ideas become very important for Sartre. So the first one, which he later disagrees with, the existence precedes essence, and then the second one, which is the rejection of what he calls deterministic excuses. So he begins the essay kind of starting out with this defense, and I'll read kind of this long quote from just the beginning here. My purpose here is to offer a defense of existentialism against several reproaches that have been laid against it. First, it has been reproached as an invitation to people to dwell in the quietism of despair. For if every way to a solution is barred, one would have to regard any action in this world as entirely ineffective, and one would arrive finally at a contemplative philosophy. Moreover, since contemplation is a luxury, this would only be another bourgeois philosophy. This especially is the reproach made by the communists. So, kind of one of the main criticisms that existentialism drew, that it's a leisurely cafe society activity. It doesn't. It's nice to kind of think and contemplate about the existence of things and the problem of intentionality, but what bearing does this actually have in social and political contexts where maybe a more pressing ethical concern is allowed? So. And this was certainly true during his time. So this picture here is of the French resistance during World War II. And kind of a little bit of background on the time period in which Sartre wrote this. Sartre had returned from World War I and already outlined his rebuttal for the problem of intentionality proposed by the phenomenologists who came before him through contingency. But another war was coming to an end, and so he wrote this kind of at the climax of World War II, actually. So there was kind of a 10-year gap in between, in which he was sort of laying out his ideas in Being and Nothingness, and then this essay was finally published. But another war was coming to an end, and the material concerns of scarce resources, invasion and occupation, and class concerns, the idea of a free, contemplative cafe lifestyle, seemed irresponsible due to the demands of the time period, particularly among the French resistance, whom Sartre was a part of, along with the Communist Party. So Sartre and a couple of his other existentialist buddies were part of this thing called the French Resistance, in which they were trying to basically kind of undermine the Vichy government that was part of the Nazi Party that had come and invaded Paris and occupied other parts of France at the time. And the French resistance, I believe Sartre started, there was like a journal or a newspaper that was circulated among resistance members, and he was very focused on, on having like art be part of this resistance process. So they tried to put on like plays and stuff that sort of undermined the efforts of like this occupation and invasion. Obviously, a lot of it had to be done in secret, otherwise it could be some very nasty consequences. So there was a whole lot at stake here, basically, when he was writing this essay, and sort of the war had come to the end. Members of the Vichy government were now facing trial, and everything was kind of up in the air, and the French people felt a great sense of liberation and freedom, but also kind of trepidation at some of maybe the older ways of society that were still kind of in existence, and thinking about ideas of freedom again, but also articulated through the lens of just having survived another war. So it's a very fraught, complicated political time period in which this essay was published. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first major point of Sartre's essay: existence precedes essence. So put simply, this means that there is nothing to dictate that person's character, goals in life, and so on, that only the individual can identify their essence. So whatever meaning in life is not going to be divinely ordained to you, you have to go and figure that out for yourself. So according to Sartre, man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and then defines himself afterwards. And specifically, ethical situations are really what are going to count for this particular definition. So it does a couple of things. First, it reverses the traditional philosophical principle, hereby one's essence, so the nature, the thingness, the humanness of the human, is more fundamental and immutable than existence, so the mere facticity of its being. Sartre's going to use the term facticity when he kind of talks about existence. Just if you ever go through Sartre and you encounter that word facticity or immanence, that usually points to the existence part of this kind of philosophical dictum. So for existentialists, consciousness is going to be the faculty that will determine essence. So the lived experience is where you're going to get that essence versus using your existence to kind of push that essence to the forefront. Okay, so this is going to take kind of a weird detour where I'm going to talk about God for a minute, only because when we're talking about, the idea of existence preceding one's essence, a lot of the times that has been traditionally understood is that God is what determines the meaning of life for you and who you are. And particularly when we're talking about the question of being, so the metaphysical question of, why a human being, what is the human being's purpose, what even is a human being, we're kind of bumping up against sort of ontological understandings. And so Martin Heidegger, at the beginning of the 20th century, which a lot of people say Sartre's philosophy is almost ripped from Heidegger, is he's trying to do metaphysics and ontology sort of post Anselm and the understanding of God and the cogito and Descartesian rationalism, or Cartesian rationalism. But there's still kind of this looming understanding of ontology as being sort of this religious, fundamentally religious thing. So I'm going to kind of explain where that comes from. So Anselm defines God as a being then greater than know which greater can be conceived, and argue that this being must exist in the mind, even if in the mind of the person who denies the existence of God. So a little bit complicated. This was one of the three main arguments kind of used to justify the existence of God. There's the ontological argument, there's the cosmological argument, being that God is the primary mover or the fundamental primary creator of things. So, and that's where you get the turtles all the way down argument. Well, if the universe was created, but then what created God? Okay, it was a giant turtle, and then there was a giant turtle stacked on the top of another giant turtle, and then turtles all the way down. So it's logically, when you get to like a certain point, it's sort of like, well, what created the creator? Which is why the cosmological argument has sort of fell back in favor. The other major argument being intelligent design, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with counter arguments to either of these, but the ontological argument has often been cited as it's kind of the saving point for the philosophical theories proving the existence of God. So this is kind of what Sartre's up against when he's trying to reverse the order and say that existence actually precedes essence. So Anselm suggested that if the greatest possible being exists in the mind, it must also exist in reality. If it exists only in the mind, then an even greater being must be possible, one that exists both in the mind and reality. Therefore, the greatest possible being must exist in reality. These are sort of the lines of the ontological argument. We can talk about this a little bit after, too, if people are really, really interested in this. But this is just to kind of set up and give you the context of like where why existence precedes essence is so groundbreaking at this time. So again, as I described, it's similar to Descartes' cogito ergo sum. This argument is itself an abstraction, and there's no way of empirically verifying it. It's a logical proof. You just sort of deduct God's existence from these principles. Okay. Forgive my use of images. So Sartre's going to talk about kind of three responses to the existence precedes essence question, one of them being abandonment. So once you sort of accept that you're sort of responsible for your own being and you're creating your own meaning in life, then there's going to be like this automatically this sense of abandonment where it's like, oh, I feel like, God has deserted me because I no longer need him or need the presence of the supernatural to dictate to me what meaning is. So for Sartre, abandonment means specifically abandonment by God. This is really important to understand. So this doesn't imply that God is a metaphysical entity. It actually existed at some point and went away. Sartre is echoing Nietzsche's famous pronouncement, God is dead. Nietzsche did not mean that God had once been alive, but rather that the belief in God was no longer a tenable position in the late 19th century. By using the word abandonment in a metaphorical way, Sartre emphasizes the sense of loss caused by the realization that there is no God to warrant our moral choices, no divinity to give us guidelines as to how to achieve salvation. The choice of words stresses the solitary position of human beings alone in the universe with no external source of objective value. So the main consequence of abandonment is, as we have seen, the absence of any objective source of moral law. Sartre objected to the approach of some atheistic moralists who, recognizing that God didn't exist, simply clung to a secular version of Christian morality without its guarantor. In order to meet the criticism that without God there can be no morality, Sartre develops his theory about the implications of freedom and the associative state of anguish. So anguish is going to be the other part that comes in and kind of reckons with this abandonment. And I should speak briefly about what this implies in terms of his second major point, which is the rejection of deterministic excuses. So the upshot of no inherent meaning is that we are free to do whatever we want within the scope of human limitation, but the problem is that we are automatically responsible for the outcome of our actions, hence the rejection of what Sartre calls deterministic excuses. So we have no longer anything we can sort of blame our actions on. The responsibility all falls on us. So not only that, but Sartre claims that in fashioning myself, I fashion man, saying that the individual's action will affect and shape mankind, that being for itself uses despair to embrace freedom and take meaningful action in full acceptance of whatever consequences may arise as a result. So not only are you responsible for your own actions, your actions dictate what everyone else is supposed to do, which even places more responsibility on the ethical acting subject. I think the term Sartre uses is being for itself. So the person acting in this case, being for itself, now all of a sudden has to determine what sort of world they want to live in through their own ethical action. And I think it's worth noting, it's kind of like that whole with great freedom comes great responsibility thing from Spider-Man. That's actually the panel where it first appears in the comic. I know a lot of people always attribute that quote to like, oh, some philosopher said that. No, it's from Spider-Man comics. And just clarifying some memes here. All right, so freedom automatically lends itself to anguish. And actually, I was doing a Google image search on anguish, and this was a painting that cropped up, sort of to that visually depicts anguish. And I think it definitely gets the job done. So Sartre believes wholeheartedly in the freedom of the will. So he is strongly anti-deterministic about human choice, seeing that the claim that one is determined in one's choices as a form of self-deception, which he gives the label bad faith. So he talks about this more in Being and Nothingness, but bad faith is essentially when you're lying to yourself about why you're doing something. So you might think you're making a choice, and it's you believe that your intentions in everything are good. However, if you're not being honest with yourself, and if you're not, kind of giving yourself to, authentic expressions of the will, then you're essentially, just lying to yourself. You're practicing bad faith. So although Sartre rejects the idea that human beings have any essence, he takes the essence of human beings to be that they are free when he declares, man is free, man is freedom. So the word freedom would have a particularly powerful appeal for people recently freed from Nazi occupation. Freedom is a word with extremely positive associations, hence its frequent appropriation by politicians who redefine it to suit their own purposes. Yet Sartre states that we are condemned to be free, a deliberate oxymoron bringing out what he believes to be the great weight of responsibility accompanying human freedom. So when you're in the state of anguish, you're, uncomfortable with this idea that you are essentially 100% responsible for your own freedom. And this, this provokes a lot of serious negative emotions in people who are used to maybe something deterministic, helping them through making these decisions. But if you don't have that, it lends itself to anguish. And the third tenet that Sartre talks about is despair. So despair, like abandonment and anguish, is an emotive term. Sartre means it by simply the existentialist attitude to the recalcitrance or obstinacy of the aspects of the world that are beyond our control, and in particular other people. In his play No Exit, one of the characters declares, hell is other people. So while freedom may be absolute, Sartre appears to affirm that there are some times where you are simply the victim of circumstance, and how you respond to it is just 100% entirely up to you. So whatever I desire to do, other people or external events may thwart. The attitude of despair is one of stoic indifference to the way things turn out. So when Descartes said, conquer yourself rather than the world, what he meant was, at the bottom, the same, that we should act without hope. So we cannot rely on anything which is outside our control, but this does not mean we should abandon ourselves to inaction. So if you remember, one of the things that existentialism was charged with, it's sort of this navel-gazing, contemplative inaction, like giving up, essentially. On the contrary, Sartre argues that it should lead us to commit ourselves to a course of action, since there is no reality except in action. As Sartre puts it, the genius to Proust is the totality of the works of Proust. Everyone is wholly defined by what they actually do, than by rather what they might have done had circumstances be different. For Sartre, there are no mute inglorious Miltons. All right, so whether or not you accept all of Sartre's philosophy, I mean, it seems like construed one way, it seems really great. We have this primacy of the individual, we have freedom, we can, abandon any strict foundationalist origins to philosophy, and we can kind of just embrace our ethics as we see fit. But then there's also, kind of the flip side of that. There's the despair, abandonment, and anguish that kind of accompanies these, this kind of bottoming out of the inherent ideas of maybe some of the religious and philosophical orthodoxies of the past. And there's also, some concerns as to whether or not Sartre actually was putting forth any type of metaphysics. So where does that leave being? If being is kind of this sort of hollow concept now, we may have no inherent meaning in things, but then can we still determine, what a human being is? So for the strict Platonists among us, this might pose a potential problem. And also, as I said before, there's a distinction between the early and later Sartre, because later in life, Sartre also rejected both of these two claims that he put forth in the essay. So it's a little bit annoying if you're trying to, think about him in the totality of his work, because there seems to be, on any given day, he tends to disagree with himself. in terms of existence precedes essence, well, at first, this seems to affirm Heidegger's bold claims in being and time. It also appears to rest on a misunderstanding of metaphysics and what essence is in relation to meaning. Meaning, in other words, one affirms metaphysics even by supposedly rejecting it. And this was Heidegger's famous counter-argument to the ideas that Sartre put forward, because he's like, well, if you have to reject being in order for freedom, you're kind of simultaneously affirming being, because if being didn't exist, you wouldn't have to reject it. Which is a very very nitpicky philosophical way of approaching the problem, but I mean, he's kind of got a point. And also these ideas, they sound good. I mean, who doesn't want to live with absolute freedom and like embracing the unknown? I mean, like that does sound kind of exhilarating, but at the same time, it's incredibly difficult to live by, because if you also remember Sartre saying that you not only dictate, your own ethical action, you're also setting an example for everyone around you, which can be paralyzing. So it's kind of both. It offers itself up to sort of new and free ways of understanding the world, but then it kind of lets those really negative emotions like abandonment and despair also creep in. So it's a little bit of both, and it's kind of, and this is the reason why the essay has remained controversial even now. I mean, you get critics kind of on both sides, either affirming or maybe even negating some of Sartre's claims. So I'm coming kind of now to the end of the presentation, but I wanted to open up the floor to any questions you might have, or if you want me to go back and explain a couple of things, because I know I dropped a lot of history of philosophy terms on you. Yes, sir.
You want to give me a speaker? Yes. Okay, brain imaging has now proven that we make all of our decisions microseconds before we are aware we have made our decisions, which means that the idea that we have choice has disappeared. How does that affect existentialism and humanism?
Well, yeah, it kind of goes back to that kind of initial claim in phenomenology that consciousness, or within existentialism, that consciousness is what's going to determine that freedom or non-freedom. So, science, neurology might have a different answer to that, and, it certainly would have implications for, like, at what point do we decisively determine free will? I mean, you're getting it down to, like, a process of seconds. So it is a very difficult thing to assess, and it would make a really good counter-argument to Sartre, too, who just kind of assumes, well, this all happens at once, and it doesn't really explain the nitty-gritty of how that process, what that process actually entails. So yeah, that's a good point. Yes?
My question is closely related. It's a very simple question. Do we have free will?
Oh, God. How much time do you have? Because free will and determinism, I mean, that's still a major debate kind of taking place in philosophy right now. Sartre obviously would err on the side of free will, but there have also been a handful of existentialist philosophers, too, that may or may not have affirmed determinism, Nietzsche being one of them, being a student of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer was very much a deterministic philosopher. So a consensus among the existentialists, definitely unclear. Consensus among philosophers in general, definitely unclear. Sartre, and also this is a distinction to be made between early Sartre and later Sartre, because later Sartre gets much, much more deterministic, kind of as he's going along, because he starts to get really into communist philosophy, and then his viewpoints change as far as freedom goes, and also his life partner Simone de Beauvoir kind of laid into him a little bit about, the idea of absolute freedom, because you also have to ask, okay, what sort of, like, maybe conditions would allow you to have absolute freedom, and you have to really think hard about those. So it's not an easy question. And I mean, you can certainly proponents of free will argue, well, even when your conditions have been determined, there's still choice within those conditions. And then determinists will fire back with, well, but even those choices have been determined. So it's really, how metaphysical do you want to get with that question? Or where would you consider free will versus determinism to crop up? So that's kind of how the question has been shaped. From my personal viewpoints, I'm undecided. But hopefully that addresses kind of what you wanted to talk about. Yeah. Yes.
So to actually build on that initial question, this is all philosophy, it's the human mind analyzing the human mind, right, in the way we think. But in modern, I think it's neuroscience would be the discipline now that looks into that. So I'm thinking Antonio Damasio looked at a lot of the consciousness from a scientific standpoint. So I'm curious, these are the original thinkers, right, by the methods of their day. This was great insight and first attempt. I'd be curious if there are any efforts to reconcile, to not bit neuroscience versus philosophy, but kind of unify that some of what Sartre said was true, then neuroimaging is another version of the truth, and try to reconcile that they were onto something and now we can prove it or disprove it. Do you see in your discipline reconciliation between the neuroscience and the philosophy?
Yeah, there are certainly like academics doing research, sort of kind of trying to unify neuroscience, but also with phenomenology. So not so much existentialism, but phenomenology being kind of that proto-existentialist philosophy that I was mentioning. So there are people kind of trying to look at, okay, what exactly is this experience of consciousness? So they're kind of grappling with the same question, but maybe they have a more empirical approach to it, where they're trying to like quantify things and then like really make sure the data can be replicated. And so a lot of the times, I don't necessarily think that neuroscience and philosophy are entirely incompatible, because you're essentially talking about the same question, but you're using different methods to sort of get at the thing that sort of the formal object of consciousness a little bit more clearly. So I mean, there are researchers doing cool stuff right now. I don't have a list of them on the top of my head, but I know they exist. That's about what I can say. Yes?
It seems to me that the problem of feeling that if the decision is made 30 milliseconds before you're aware of it is only a problem if you refuse to accept that you're more than just that theater of consciousness. What happens is we make the decision and then we become aware of it 30 milliseconds later. But it was us that made the decision.
That's fine.
I should be embarrassed to admit this, but every time I read the word metaphysics, my main mind goes into kind of a tailspin, like, does that really mean?
Oh, do you want like a quick definition? Okay. So within philosophy, we tend to categorize the different disciplines and branches as either falling under three categories. So there's metaphysics, epistemology, and then ethics, or political philosophy. So metaphysics is the study that concerns the questions of being. So what is a thing? What is a human being? What is the actual substance that we're looking at? And a lot of the times, historically in the past, natural philosophers were trying to get at the very things that science had not yet developed. But I think today metaphysics is more trying to talk about the existence of things in kind of a more broad, abstract way. So when we're getting at the questions of being, like what is a human being, we're not especially confined to biology. We're also talking about like what is the meaning of human life and those type of questions. Epistemology is questions of knowledge. So how we think about things, how do we engage with thought, what is an idea? And then ethics and political philosophy is fairly self-explanatory. There's questions of action, and whether that action happens in the public sphere or interpersonally, it kind of developed along the same lines. So those are the three main branches of philosophy. We're mostly concerned for the purpose of this essay, so questions of being. So when we're talking about existence versus essence, so this is an ontological question. This is a question where we're trying to figure out, okay, is the natural meaning of human life ordained by anything, or are we free to create it? So this is where also the free will and determinism question kind of dovetails in a little bit. Does that help you out a little bit? Okay, all right. I can come back to this. Yes?
Are you familiar at all with the book Superstition in All Ages by Jean Mesler?
I am not, but enlighten me.
It was supposed to have been written by a French curate, and it was actually probably written by a French scientist who didn't want to be hung or quartered or anything else.
Sounds about right.
It was primarily a emotional text, except for one paragraph, and that is matter moves itself. So matter moves itself, the basis of science. So I would be interested how that fits in for all of that, because it's predates that by quite a ways.
Sartre would have read some of these texts or been aware of them, because he was a fairly prolific reader, and he was trying to sort of engage interdisciplinary as much as possible. But I mean, the short answer would just be, I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile that, but I mean, it seems like it would be an interesting kind of intersection between the two. Sort of what that means then for existence precedes essence, if matter moves itself. So yeah, I don't know. Yes. Hi.
Yeah, I was very interested in hearing more about intentionality versus contingency, because it seemed like that was a pretty basic concept. And we whipped right on by, and maybe I just didn't absorb it.
That's fine.
But also, the thing that where it went clang for me, it sounds like he talks about a feeling of obligation in this kind of idea. It implies a morality or an ethic that it seems to me stands aside from his idea of freedom, because freedom is, you could have a totally hedonistic, narcissistic notion about how to proceed with one's life. So that struck, I wonder if we had a little rolling tag left from him, his religiosity. Also, there was so much in there. Kierkegaard, talking about this possibility of taking responsibility for what others do.
Right.
Again, what is it, the categorical imperative? Is that, it's a Kierkegaard thing?
It seems a little bit like he's trying to echo Kant, in that sense. But, in a very strange sort of way, where it's like, yeah, well, you're not obligated to do this, but you are. And which I think also drew some criticism for the essay as well, because I mean he sort of outlines this project. He kind of gives a few anecdotal examples, but he doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty of like, well, what does that look like? How do you even live that? Even for a philosopher who tends to like default to lived experience as much as possible, it didn't seem like he had a real clear conception for like how one goes about that. Because it does seem a little bit like the categorical imperative on steroids.
Yeah, and then it seems to me when I'm looking at humanism, I think in humanism where it's different from, I mean, we take this idea of personal responsibility seriously, but I think in humanism there's a built-in idea about there's a positive component to human nature that tends toward what we call health and self-actualization. And this thing, because when I hear freedom leads to abandonment, leads to anguish, leads to despair, it leads to head scratching, because it sounds good to me. Anyway, but more about intentionality and contingency.
Okay. All right. So with the intentionality and contingency thing, a lot of it boils down to this problem within early modern philosophy where, okay, you're trying to prove, consciousness, but you're also trying to prove the existence of God. You're trying to prove various things, but you can't get outside of the problem of like, okay, is it contained in the mind or is it contained in the world? So the rationalists believed that everything was contained in the mind. And that the mind was, so we're talking about philosophers like Descartes, we're talking Spinoza, Leibniz, so these kind of early mathematicians thought that, abstraction is actually where the thing the formal object of consciousness lies. This was in contrast to the British empiricists, so people like David Hume, who kind of believed that the formal object of consciousness is somewhere out there in the world. So I do not need an abstract conception of chair in order to understand chair, because chair is right there. I did not mean for that to rhyme, but but you kind of get what I'm saying, right? It's the problem of whether, does it exist in the mind or does it exist in the world? And so intentionality also proposes some problems, because there are things that do exist in the mind where you think like mythical creatures, or like various concepts like math, for example, kind of exists in its own sort of abstract. We can't point at anything in the world and say, that's math, unless you have numbers written down. It's meant as a kind of a placeholder of more conceptual understanding. So it's a murky problem, because we have things that kind of exist in both spheres, neither spheres, or it's difficult to say, where exactly they fall. So start trying to neatly solve the problem of intentionality, being that there's a formal object, it's somewhere, whether it's all in my head or it's out there, it's contingent. So when I say contingent, so like the things that exist in the mind are contingent upon the mind being there. The things that exist in the world are contingent upon the understanding of an external world or belief in the external world. Or simultaneously, if this is all a dream or I'm making all of this up, it's contingent upon whatever dreamscape that I've constructed. So it's in relation to something. It doesn't have to be absolutely this or that, but it's a relation. And you always have to think of it relationally in order to kind of get past that problem of where is it? Where exactly is the thing? Well, if we have the tools where we can kind of conceive of it, placing it in a particular location doesn't actually matter. Does that answer the question a little bit more? Okay, good. Okay, good. Excellent, yeah.
Okay. This stuff is pretty complicated.
Yeah.
And if I sit here and I say, I'd like to wait till the movie comes out, well, I'm about 40 to 100 years behind on catching up with movies anyway. But so I think maybe the movie's already been made, and if it has, you probably could recommend us what it would be, what movies we should see that would help us understand the portent of existentialism as part of humanism.
Okay. I don't have a movie, but I have a book. Pretty close. There's a really, really great biography sort of all of the existentialists. It's by a lady named Sarah Bakewell. She also wrote a really great book on Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, who is the famous essayist. It's called, the book, though, that I want to talk about is called At the Existentialist Cafe. And it's a group biography of sort of all the existentialists kind of in that sort of post-war, early 20th century. But the thing I like about this biography is it's an intellectual history of sort of everyone and sort of what problems they were talking about of the time. It's very clear. It's not dense at all. You don't need to have like a real grasp on like the history of philosophy or anything like that to comprehend it. But it just really nicely explains the problems and then sort of how they arise in their historical context and then why, they were so concerned with certain things. So it does talk about intentionality quite a bit, and a really fun kind of historical detail is like Sartre originally came up with his idea of contingency while he was on mescaline. Oh, and he was walking down the Champs-Elysees like hallucinating giant sea creatures were like attacking him, and then that's how he came to the conclusion, well, this is all contingent, because I took mescaline and none of this matters. But yeah, so it's a lot of stuff like that. So you kind of see the philosophers as people and sort of how they came to these particular conclusions, but it's not posited in so much here's the discourse and here's all the stuff that came before that and here's what you have to understand if you have to get to this problem. It's a little bit more kind of friendly and just sort of inviting you to the conversation and kind of getting you more in touch with some of these problems and why they're important. So at the Existentialist Cafe, Sarah Bakewell, really, really excellent book. Highly recommend it.
We do have more questions, but I want to make sure you finished your presentation.
It is finished. Okay. Yeah, we're good.
So
yes.
I'm, excuse me, I'm wondering about, you're talking about the individual's impact on the group. What about the group's impact on the individual? And does he deal with that kind of stuff? And how does he deal with it? And because it sounds like it's somehow just arising from the person without any kind of cultural context.
Yeah, so that's another good criticism of existentialism too, is it kind of separates the individual from context or historicity a little bit. I think maybe later Sartre would have a better answer to that question, because obviously he becomes a fully fledged member of the Communist Party, which is a very, like, their ideology is very much concentrated in the collective good as over the individual good. So it's kind of unclear, at least within like some of the early Sartre and some of his like plays and books and stuff like that. It's sort of like we only get the individual's experience. We don't, and whenever the group is involved, it's sort of like this annoyance, like, ugh, other people, are just thwarting all of my projects and just causing problems for me. So that's kind of like what the role of the collective seems to play in early Sartre and kind of early existentialism. But I think later on, I don't think they're necessarily as incompatible as maybe some of Sartre's early works make it believe. Actually, the collective, it has implications for the collective, what's good for the individual. And sort of, if we are to sort of take up this idea that, your ethical actions have implications for everybody else, then there might have to be some room for some consensus to be achieved. So I don't have like a easy answer, but I think that there is room possibly for kind of a collective and an individual. They don't necessarily have to be as opposed, but certainly within this essay, it's pretty clear that he's emphasizing the individual over the collective. It's almost like it's not even considered in existentialist philosophy. I mean, if you think, and some of this might have to do with where it came from in phenomenology, because phenomenology, in the phenomenological reduction, you're only concerned with the individual consciousness and the other individual consciousness. You're not necessarily talking about, context or the background information. You're reducing it to whatever that moment is, which may or may not be good or bad or messy. So that might be a leftover from Husserl, where Sartre was only concerned with one consciousness dealing with the other. A better philosopher who would have maybe more of an answer to the idea of a collective or even like a collective origins would be Emmanuel Levinas. So he was one of the students of Husserl I talked about earlier, along with Heidegger. And he wrote Time and the Other. He was a German Jewish philosopher who spent quite some time in the concentration camp, so he really had an understanding of how individual decisions can impact lots of people. And he has like a better understanding of, maybe a more compassionate understanding of when you're entered into that two consciousnesses opposing each other, you have to consider where they came from and that collective origin, so like where the individual was brought up in. So that might be a better way of reckoning with the problem. Yes?
I'm a little disappointed. I was hoping to hear you talk about Albert Camus.
Oh, yeah. Next time.
Then we're going to have the pleasure of you another time?
Yeah, exactly.
I was wondering if, since forever philosophy has been very cerebral, people just speculating about, things. But now we're starting to see the brain science and, brain scans and things like that. And the concept is getting to be more along the lines of our brains are trying to create models of what they see in the world, that we don't really see reality directly because we're seeing it through our senses. So how has that affected philosophy?
Well, depending on the approach, because you also have to understand something about philosophy too, is like there's kind of a divide as far as like what particular areas you study within philosophy. So it's not like philosophy has one answer for how it approaches neuroscience. So if you come from like an analytic philosophy background, you're already going to be very heavily versed in the scientific method and kind of have very quantified answers as far as when you're approaching the question of how philosophy and the brain are kind of interrelated. If you're going from a continental philosophy approach, I mean, that tends to talk about more of like the sort of the social and the ethical implications and how like art and literature are involved and all of that. And there's actually been some continental philosophers who talk about the brain and things like neuroplasticity, for example. So there was one philosopher with the school that I studied at in Kingston University. Her name is Catherine Malibu, and she wrote this book called What Should We Do with Our Brain? And it talks about neuroplasticity and sort of like the recent developments in neuroscience, but the title is What Should We Do with Our Brains? So, given that, we've come to these particular conclusions of like what science has given us, then conversely, what are the ways in which we can more ethically orient society based on the information that we're finding? So it means different things to different camps within kind of the spectrum of philosophy. And I don't think they're necessarily opposed to each other either. I mean, there can be great ways where like science can inform philosophy and philosophy can inform science and vice versa. So it kind of all depends on like, what we find and then like what steps we kind of can take to deal with the implications of that. So it depends is my short answer. Yes?
Yeah. You talked about mind and the world outside.
Mm-hmm.
In this context, quantum mechanics creates a dichotomy, in the sense that quantum mechanics posits that a measurement is made, something exists only when a measurement is made, which means some consciousness comes into play. Now, you can ask then whether the universe exists only when the consciousness came, or did it exist outside before that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may try to circumvent it by saying that, well, maybe we are not talking about consciousness just here on the earth, somewhere or other civilization may be there, and that consciousness was there. But did universe come first and consciousness came later, or they came the other way or together? This sort of becomes a confusing thing. On the other hand, we do find that whatever, this principle of quantum mechanics seems to be verified by various experiments there. So how does one react to that?
Yeah. So this is also a history of philosophy question, because when we're talking about kind of the early modern debates is like, what is the formal object of consciousness? Is it out in the world? Does it exist in the mind? So Immanuel Kant kind of came up with a response to this, which sort of actually conveniently lended itself to phenomenology fairly well. So the way he synthesized whether consciousness exists or whether the object exists in the mind or in the world, we may not have like a definitive answer for that, and I mean this could be maybe quantum mechanics does, but in philosophy we don't. That all consciousness is mediated, so our experiences are mediated by the mind. So the mind is filtering whether or not the object actually exists in the world or the mind is doing the filtering. So within philosophy, this is understood as the transcendental turn within the history of philosophy. So Kant saying that, you know, we can't get outside of the mind. Even when we're analyzing the outside world, you know, the mind is the faculty with which we're viewing that world. So it adds another layer of difficulty, and some other philosophers have said, well, this is why, you know, earliest 20th century philosophy can't do that much, is because Kant already, you know, dropped this bombshell that we have to, we're always dealing with the mind somehow. We can't just get at experience outside of our own consciousness. So there's no maybe one easy way to deal with it, but the way Sartre dealt with it is just we're not interested in kind of verifying whether the formal object is in the world or in the mind. We're only dealing with contingency. So even if everything is kind of being filtered through the mind, that contingency is the mind. And so that's why consciousness is the faculty with which we all of a sudden have to deal with meaning. Does that address your question? Okay.
Yes, hi there. I'd like to start off by thanking you. This is a very difficult topic.
Thank you.
Topics. And I greatly appreciate it. We don't get enough of these sort of conversations, so I appreciate you being here.
Great.
I'd like to go back to an earlier question or a situation where Sartre became a communist.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of that during those times when there was a choice to be a capitalist, a socialist, a communist, etc. And juxtaposing that to today, where there's such a dichotomy of philosophies, regardless of where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
And is there within the philosophical community of yesterday and today that might be able to explain where we are in the differences in philosophies in America specifically?
Okay. It's interesting because, yeah, American philosophy is kind of a chimera. Just because being a colonial power, you know, we had a lot of the time, and the process of colonialism kind of shaping what we might even call American philosophy. So you had, you know, people like Ben Franklin importing ideas from Europe and, you know, sort of establishing circles of thought and things like that. And you can point in the 19th century, there was the American Transcendentalist movement, which a lot of people have characterized as a literary movement, but it was also a philosophical movement. So people like, you know, Thoreau, Whitman and others, you know, kind of pioneering that American philosophy. I'd say also the closest thing you can get to like something like as an American philosophy would be like American pragmatism, for example. So you're reading William James, John Dewey, Richard Rorty, and that has also been separately criticized. It's more methodological, so it's more focused on sort of how you go about and approach inquiry versus thinking about something like ontology or metaphysics, which European philosophers have often criticized American philosophy as not having an ontology or a metaphysics. So as far as the political situation, I mean, that's kind of a different animal, but within France, I mean, it seems at least that political philosophy and, you know, the current state of politics were a little bit more closely related than they are here. So when we think of, you know, American philosophy as having any influence on, you know, our political discourse, maybe yes, but the two aren't almost as closely related as you might see in like a European power, for example. So it's really hard to say, and certainly there will be people who disagree with me and be like, no, it's always been, you know, these ideals about stuff, but it seems like there's a little bit more of a disconnect, and that's why you get in American philosophical institutions where it's kind of like they're still reckoning with the question, is philosophy relevant? Because in sort of the United States, it didn't have that as much of a tradition as maybe in a European colonial power. So maybe. This is just one way it's been conceived of, like, why don't we have a uniquely American philosophy? And the answer is we kind of do, but as far as to what its capabilities are, it's really it's questionable. So hopefully that addressed your question, maybe a little bit. Talk more about it.
And Kelly, we're out of time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It was